Good evening. My name is Bob Jacobson. I'm the Dean of Undergraduate Studies at the University of California, and it is my honor to supervise the military affairs programs here. Tonight, I'd like to introduce the speaker at this Nimitz Memorial Lecture. But first, to set the stage, I want to point out that Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz has a range of accomplishments that not everyone is aware of. He is well known for his role in the Second World War in the Pacific Fleet, but before that, he was an innovator that led to, among other things, the presence of reserve officers in the Navy, which in turn led directly to the reserve officer training course here at Berkeley and other places, and in large part to the all-volunteer military that we have today, an important thing to remember. He was also a technical innovator. I'm a physicist in my day job, and he was one of the people who brought to us the nuclear navy, again, something that's made a very significant difference in the world. And it's very appropriate for us to recognize people with this range, people who have affected the world by thinking deeply about the innovations that are necessary to advance what we do. Fleet Admiral Nimitz also had a connection to Berkeley that few people know about, is he retired here. He lived in the city of Berkeley along with several of his colleagues after the Second World War, after he finished his service to the country. And it's good to remember that we are a part of that community, that the city of Berkeley has ties to many different parts of the world, many different parts of the community. But really, I'm up here to introduce our speaker. That was a little bit of a prologue to the idea of the effective citizen, scholar, and innovator. And our speaker tonight, Dr. John Nagl, fits that quite well. Having graduated from both the military academy and as a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford, he went on to command a tank battalion in war. Now he spends his time thinking deeply and clearly, a very useful combination, about national security issues. So it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. John Nagl.
Thank you, Dean, for that kind introduction. Thank all of you for being here this evening. I've just declared a snow day at the school I run back home in Haverford, Pennsylvania. It is great to be in California tonight. This is a homecoming for me. I was actually born at Mare Island Nuclear Base in Vallejo, California, 49 years and 4 days ago. That was exactly 8 days after the passing of Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz, also here in this town. And so I feel some connection to the man, to the great man. I feel compelled to share with you one additional little-known fact about Admiral Chester Nimitz. And that is, although many people, and certainly every Naval Academy graduate knows that Chester Nimitz was a member of the Naval Academy class of 1907, fairly few people know, and certainly no Naval Academy graduates would ever admit, that before Admiral Nimitz was accepted into the Naval Academy class of 1907, he applied for and was rejected at our nation's military academy, West Point, New York. There are a number of ways we can take this particular fact, and certainly the midshipmen, the naval officers, the Naval Academy graduates in the room would say that this points out that the United States Military Academy at West Point is incapable of making good assessments of a person's character, military abilities, intellect, innovation, drive, all the great attributes that the Dean just mentioned. I'd prefer to think of it in a slightly different perspective, and that is, imagine if he'd gone to West Point, what the guy could have done, right? So, an honor, obviously, to be here. My father, I was born on Mare Island because my father was a nuclear submariner, part of Hyman Rickover's nuclear navy. One of the great things that Chester Nimitz did was promote the ideas of Admiral Rickover. And between Nimitz and Rickover, I think really the modern nuclear navy, really one of the guarantors of peace and security and economic growth and freedom in the world, I believe, happened. And I'll talk more about that over the course of the evening. But I'm going to start with my feet firmly in the sand, if I can. So I graduated from West Point in 1988. Right at the end of the Cold War, went on to Oxford to study international relations, and was delighted and astonished when international relations happened while I was studying at Oxford. The Cold War came to an end in 1989 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union brought to an end really by an insurgency in Afghanistan, the Mujahideen, sponsored by the United States and by Saudi Arabia, defeated the Soviet military in what was really, I think, the Soviet Union's Vietnam. It was a death knell from which the Soviet Union never recovered. And so I got to see that happening from Oxford. We actually canceled classes and came to Berlin and literally got our piece of the rock. And I was still evaluating what this meant for a young armor officer West Point graduate, and tried hard to write about that effectively on my final exams at Oxford in the summer of 1990, when international relations suddenly happened again. Saddam Hussein decided that Iraq really wasn't big enough. It needed a 19th province. He was suffering from financial difficulties incurred during his own war, the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s. And so Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, captured Kuwait in August of 1990. And Saddam, a tyrannical leader, a very brutal ruler, also not a very good intelligence officer, clearly didn't realize that I just graduated from Oxford and been assigned to the 1st Cavalry Division at Fort Hood, Texas. If he'd realized that, obviously, he would have known this was not a wise choice. And so I became part of a tank platoon, 4 tanks, 15 men, and learned to soldier in the desert of Saudi Arabia, and ultimately participated in Operation Desert Storm, a splendid little war. Was very proud of my small role in that war, in which we took the Iraqi army from the 4th largest in the world to the 2nd largest in Iraq in a period of just 100 hours. And we were able to do so, I have to admit, it pains me to say this, but with the Army Air Corps here on your left, my right, the greatest Air Force in the history of the planet had more than softened them up for us. And it is a wonderful thing, having served in 2 wars now. When an airplane flies overhead, to never to have to wonder whether it's friendly or enemy. Right? We've worked under absolute air superiority in both of my wars, and that's because of the efforts of our naval forces, our air forces, and thank you for that. In your honor, Air Force, Army Air Corps, I will tell you a joke that I heard every day, every single day I spent as a West Point exchange cadet, semi-affectionately called Grunt, at the Air Force Academy, my junior year at West Point. And the joke was, what does a grunt say when an F-16 flies overhead? And the answer is, Anyway, Desert Storm went really, really well, and it went really, really well for the United States. President George H.W. Bush said, by God, we've licked the Vietnam syndrome once and for all. A sign went up on the Pentagon that said, we only do deserts. And the U.S. military decided to spend the next decade, the decade of the 1990s, getting even better at something it was already the best in the world at: fighting other militaries in mirror image conventional force-on-force battles. And the rest of the world said, boy, these guys are really good at conventional force-on-force battles. Let's not fight them that way. And I was given the extraordinary opportunity after Desert Storm to continue my education, to go back to Oxford to get my PhD, because we all make sacrifices for national security. And I decided when I had that wonderful opportunity to look not at the kind of war I just fought, tank on tank, plane on plane kind of war, but at the kind of war I thought we were likely to see in the future, a much more ancient and difficult kind of war against insurgents and assassins and terrorists, right? And so if you're doing that at Oxford, of course, you have to read the works of T.E. Lawrence of Arabia. And Lawrence was not a counterinsurgent, as I lay some claim to be, but an insurgent. He led a band of Arab guerrillas against a conventional, in his case, Turkish army, during the First World War. And he actually felt sorry for them. He said, for them, we're like a vapor. We rise up out of the sand, congeal, strike, and dissolve back into the sand. They're like a blind boxer. They could kill us if they could only find us. For them, war on rebellion was messy and slow, like eating soup with a knife. And I read that phrase in the bathtub at Oxford. I'd been for a run. Running is physical exercise, Air Force. I'd been for a run on Oxford Sport Meadow. I was in the tub, drinking champagne, eating strawberries, because it's Oxford. That's what you do there, right? I won't follow the joke with what you do at Berkeley, the equivalent. I literally read the phrase and said, Eureka, I've found it. I have the title of my dissertation, Learning to Eat Soup with a Knife. 7 words down, 99,993 to go. So to fill those 99,993 words, I decided to look at 2 previous cases where armies had struggled to come to terms, not with conventional force-on-force war, but with war against insurgents and assassins, war with vapors, war with ghosts. Right? And I looked at the cases of the British Army in Malaya, what we today call Malaysia. And the Brits from 1948 to 1960 fought a communist insurgent enemy in that country, and they won in what is today viewed as the classic case of successful Western counterinsurgency in the 20th century. And it only took them 12 years. So when Lawrence said this kind of war was messy and slow, he wasn't kidding. And the reason it was so slow is that the British Army wasn't designed to fight insurgents and assassins. It was designed to fight other armies. It was coming right out of World War II, where it had done just that. But the Brits adapted, they learned, and they ultimately succeeded. And I compared that case with the American Army in Vietnam, which also started badly when fighting insurgents, as you would expect. It also adapted and learned, as you would hope. But it didn't learn fast enough. When a great power loses a small war, it does so for one reason and one reason only. It's not going to run out of tanks. It's not going to run out of fighter planes. It's not going to run out of ships. It's going to run out of will, national will. And that's what happened in Vietnam, with extraordinarily costly consequences for the people of South Vietnam, who suffered horribly, for the entire region. The Khmer Rouge came to power in Cambodia, I would argue, as a direct result of our failings. I commend the film The Killing Fields to all of you as a depiction of the consequences of our failures in Vietnam, and enormous damage to our army and our nation. It took well over a generation for our army to recover from the trauma of Vietnam, if it has, right? And so I concluded that armies that can learn and adapt, and in particular that can learn and adapt how to fight insurgencies, give benefit to their states and the international system, and I believed that we needed to build armies that could adapt and learn to that kind of fight. And I completed that work in 1997, and I am proud to tell this audience that it was the best, the very best, doctoral dissertation written on counterinsurgency in that entire decade of the 1990s. And I am embarrassed to tell you that it was the worst doctoral dissertation written on counterinsurgency in the 1990s, because it was the only one, right? And I found out just how odd I was. You probably picked that up already. When I tried to get my masterwork published, and I sent it off to presses, good presses who are well regarded in the international security field, and I won't embarrass them by mentioning their names now. Excuse me. Excuse me, sorry. Pardon me. Who literally wrote back to me and asked me why I was studying ancient history, why I didn't study something with some contemporary relevance. Right. And then came the attacks of September 11th, and suddenly people were interested in this kind of war again. and I was finally able to get the darn thing published. Having written the book, I then went and did the research, and in general, cadets and midshipmen, I would encourage you to do that in the opposite direction, right? But having written a book on counterinsurgency, I was then sent off to fight a counterinsurgency campaign for the first time after the unnecessary, misguided fiasco, not that I feel strongly about it, invasion of Iraq in March of 2003. Right? I got to see what insurgency was like for myself. And I didn't think it was going to be easy. I'd called my book about it Learning to Eat Soup with a Knife, which doesn't really sound like something you recommend to your friends, right? But I found out it was way, way worse than I'd ever imagined it could be. Over the course of our year in Anbar province, we were stationed in the town called Khaldiya. Khaldiya, a lovely town near the center of Anbar province, Iraq's Wild West. You probably haven't heard of it, but it was between, I'll give you a little sense, it was between the provincial capital of Ramadi and a town named Fallujah, which has a reputation for being particularly welcoming to visitors. So you get a sense of the neighborhood. It was in not the best neighborhood, but not the worst. I actually bought some property there. We were thinking about retiring there, but the schools are better in Philadelphia, so that's where we ended up. Right? Tough town. Over the course of our year learning to conduct counterinsurgency in Anbar, my task force lost 23 men, had more than 150 wounded, and earned the Valorous Unit Award. And at the end of our year of fighting, we were no closer to victory than we had been when we started. And let me explain our dilemma to you a little bit. Khaldiya was the center of our sector, but we were responsible for a large swath of largely agricultural land, villages, towns around Khaldiya. The total sector, perhaps 60,000 people. Of those 60,000, as near as we could tell, 300 or so, about 0.5%, were actively trying to kill me and my guys. 300 against a tank battalion task force of 800. I had tanks, Bradleys, artillery, gunships, fixed wing on call, naval gunfire, right? You name it, I could have had it if only they would stand up and fight me force on force. I could have taken those 300 in 2, maybe 3 minutes and called it a day. Of course, they knew that too, and they very wisely chose not to fight me force on force, but to hide among the people, as Mao said, to act as fish swimming in the sea of the people. And so in my first war, right, where it was relatively easy to figure out who the enemy was, he was in the tanks that didn't look like mine, and my job was to shoot them, right? So it's relatively hard to kill that enemy, but it's pretty easy to figure out who it is. In this kind of war, removing your enemy from the battlefield is not hard at all. He's not a hard target if you can only figure out who he is. And we were unable to do so because they intimidated the population, which was either frightened of them, of the intimidation, of the risk of injury or death at their hands, or who in many cases in Anbar in 2003, 2004, actively supported the Sunni-based insurgency and thought that they provided a better alternative than the American-supported Shia-dominated government of Iraq at that time. And so after our year of fighting ghosts, fighting an enemy we could rarely see, these 300 we were fighting against, and we removed way more than 300 people from the battlefield over the course of our year, killed or captured. Some of them the right people, many of them not. But whether they were the right people or not, when we removed them from the battlefield, their brothers, literally their brothers, rose up to fight us. And so we were no further ahead when we stopped after our year of excruciating combat than we had been when we started. My battle captain printed up mugs, coffee mugs, that said Iraq 2003, 2004. We were winning when I left. We weren't. We knew it. And I was sent from Anbar province almost directly to the E-Ring of the Pentagon to work for Deputy Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz, which was a big change from Iraq. At least in Iraq, I'd had some idea who I was fighting against. And it is an extraordinarily discouraging event to be out on point for the nation, struggling to understand who your enemy is, what your purpose is, what your government needs you to do, but always believing that somewhere somebody has those answers if you could only find them out, and going to Washington and finding out not so much. Right. And so I decided to try to help us figure those things out, and I was privileged and deeply assisted by the fact that I knew some of the people who were engaged in the war effort at higher levels, and one of those was a guy named Petraeus, David Petraeus. Captain David Petraeus had been one of my teachers at West Point. And cadets and midshipmen, I'm confident you look up to the captains, the lieutenants, the colonels who you work with here at Cal Berkeley, in the same way that I looked up to people like Captain David Petraeus when I was a cadet, and I thought he was something pretty special, and I was sure he was going to go all the way to full colonel, and I was right. David Petraeus, at age 30, a pretty impressive guy. He was finishing his doctoral dissertation at Princeton while teaching at West Point, and turned out pretty well. He was by now a three-star general on his way back from his second tour in Iraq, rebuilding the Iraqi security forces that we had cleverly demobilized against his advice and the advice of many earlier in the war. And Petraeus was en route to take command of the Army's Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, where the Army does its thinking. And yes, the Army does do some thinking, Navy and Air Force. And I got the opportunity to talk to him a little bit, and I said, General, we need to write a new instruction manual for how to conduct counterinsurgency warfare. We don't know what we're doing out in the field. None of us have been trained or educated how to do this. We need a new book. And Petraeus said, John, that's a great idea. Why don't you get to work writing that book for me? Right, and he's a tough guy to say no to. Ultimately, the lead pen on the project became his West Point classmate. Cadets, midshipmen, look around. Right? Your buddies sitting to your left and your right may hunt you down and ask you to do important things for the nation 20 years, 30 years from now. In his case, Petraeus had sat right next to a guy named Conrad Crane in his military history class at West Point. We call it art, which is sort of funny. Petraeus remembered Conrad Crane as a pretty good student of military history. Con later went on to get his PhD. I think we've got Stanford in the room. Stanford in the room? Anybody? At least a couple Stanford hands. Conrad Crane had gotten his PhD in history at Stanford and became the lead author of the Counterinsurgency Field Manual. The team came together. Petraeus' counterpart was a guy named Jim Mattis, who was the 30th Nimitz lecturer last year and may have told you some of this story. Remarkable man, truly remarkable man. He'd been my boss in Anbar province during the second half of my year there. Made the motto of the 1st Marine Division, the 1st MARDIV, no better friend, no worse enemy, first do no harm. When you've got a Marine two-banger choosing the Hippocratic Oath for his combat motto, right, in a brutal counterinsurgency campaign, you've got a pretty special Marine two-star. And the Marines, to their credit, recognized that he was pretty special, hung a 3rd star on him, and put him in charge of the Marine Corps thinking at Quantico and at the Marine Combat Development Command. And so Petraeus and Mattis came together, Conrad Crane, the lead pen, and we started in November 2005, and in December of 2006, we finished the U.S. Army Marine Corps Counterinsurgency Field Manual. And ladies and gentlemen, just because the Army and the Marines do an awful lot of the same things on the same battlefield, using the same weapons against the same enemy to accomplish the same national objectives, don't think that they often agree on how to do those things. And so the fact that it was an Army and Marine Corps book was a fairly remarkable accomplishment, as was the timeline. Writing one of those books usually takes 3 to 5 years, but we simply didn't have the time. Iraq was unraveling around our ears as we were writing it. And the basic dynamic of the Iraq War, the Sunni population of Iraq is a minority of the population of that country, perhaps 25 to 30% of the population. Saddam Hussein, a Sunni. The Sunnis had all but exclusive control of the political power in Iraq. When we toppled Saddam Hussein and imposed democracy, what we were really doing was disenfranchising the Sunnis and giving control of Iraq to the Shia majority of that country. The Sunnis were not happy with that and decided to fight against us, and then later against the Shia-dominated government that was installed, that we helped install. And they did that with car bombs, with snipers, with roadside bombs, with the classic tools, ambushes, booby traps of insurgent warfare. And the Shia responded with the classic tools of repression and torture and murder that counterinsurgent forces tend to use in this kind of situation. And over the course of 2006, after the bombing of the Golden Dome Mosque, one of the most holy symbols of the Shiite religion, the Shiite sect of Islam, the Shia took the gloves off. And Iraq descended into full-scale civil war over the course of 2006 as we were writing the Counterinsurgency Field Manual. And by the end of that summer, that hot, long summer of 2006, bodies were turning up, dozens and dozens of bodies of Sunni young men were turning up on the streets of Baghdad daily, and Sunni men had tortured by Shia-dominated security forces, and Sunni young men had taken to tattooing their phone numbers on their thighs because the thigh tended to survive torture, and there was then a hope that someone would, when they found the body, call the phone number and tell their mom they were dead. And the situation was so bad that foreign policy became an issue in an American political election, which doesn't happen very often. And in the midterm elections of 2006, the Republicans lost control of both the House and the Senate. If America had a parliamentary system of government like a civilized country, our government would have fallen. Because we don't, the President Bush, had the chance to try one more time and made, in my opinion, both the bravest and the best decisions of his presidency, replacing Secretary of Defense Don Rumsfeld with Secretary of Defense Bob Gates, replacing his commander in Iraq with General David Petraeus, and surging an extra 30,000 troops to Iraq to try to implement the new counterinsurgency strategy that Petraeus had just spent a year writing. This was an event unparalleled to my knowledge in military history. A commander had just spent a year figuring out what he was going to do if he were given command in a theater of war. He published his answer, and then he was given the chance to implement it, right? And he confronted two major problems. One was the raging insurgency that I've just discussed, and the other was the complete lack of support here in the United States, the big challenge, the lack of will that I previously discussed, which is the reason why great powers like the United States lose small wars like the war in Iraq. And so Petraeus faced twin challenges. And those of us who supported him and who had worked on this project found different ways to contribute. I was not able to go over to Iraq, was not assigned to go over to Iraq with him. Instead, I became part of the team trying to put time onto the Washington clock, trying to buy him time here at home. And so with the publication of the Counterinsurgency Field Manual about a month after the midterm elections on December 15th, 2006, we received an extraordinary degree of public interest in the publication of an Army Marine Corps manual. The book was downloaded 1.5 million times in the month after it was published. It was translated and critiqued on jihadi websites. Copies were found in Taliban training camps in Pakistan. so we knew our enemy was reading it. We just had to get our guys to do that. And so my role in the putting time on the Washington clock fight was getting our guys to read the manual. And that information campaign ultimately resulted in the publication of the Counterinsurgency Manual by the University of Chicago Press, and in a fairly extraordinary turn of events, appearing on The Daily Show with Jon Stewart to have the funniest discussion Jon Stewart has ever had on camera about an Army Marine Corps field manual. And I'm very confident when I tell you that. We were able to put enough time on the clock, on the Washington clock, to give Petraeus time to implement the new doctrine on the ground in Iraq. And the book has really just two basic pillars. First, in conventional war, as I've discussed, the hard part isn't finding your enemy, it's killing him. In irregular war, the hard part is finding him. And so we argued in the book, the key to finding your enemy in a counterinsurgency campaign is not focusing on the enemy, but focusing on the population, on the sea in which your enemy swims. And so we said, you have to protect the population first. If you do that, and only if you do that, they'll feel safe enough to tell you who the enemy is, who the insurgents are in their midst. And so protect the population first. And the second core precept of the Counterinsurgency Manual, drawn from some of my work on innovation, a fact of which I hope Admiral Nimitz approves, is learn and adapt. And Petraeus implemented both of those precepts fairly remarkably well during his 18 months in command in Iraq. First, protect the population. He built 76 joint security stations scattered throughout Baghdad. Each joint security station had American forces, Iraqi military forces, and Iraqi police forces. They then walled off the city, separated it into small, bite-sized pieces with concrete T-walls, and created security for the population. And that was an important step forward, but it was not decisive. The decisive phase of the war came when Petraeus decided to support the Sunni tribes when they stopped fighting with al-Qaeda in Iraq against us and instead decided to fight with us against al-Qaeda in Iraq. And it's worth spending a minute discussing why they did that. Al-Qaeda in Iraq are radical Salafi jihadis, Sunnis. The Sharia law they wish to impose, they impose whenever they get the chance, is extraordinarily draconian. It includes cutting the fingers off of anyone they catch smoking, right? And forced marriage is the taking of war brides, and extraordinary disrespect to the tribal power structures inside Anbar. And the Sunnis got tired of that and ultimately decided to fight with us. Petraeus made the extraordinary decision, without consulting Washington, to back the Sunnis, people who literally had American blood on their hands. But the enemy of my enemy is my friend. We backed the Sunnis in what became known as the Sawa, or the Awakening, and violence in Iraq was reduced by more than 3/4 over the course of just 18 months. And the extraordinary work of David Petraeus under ridiculously difficult circumstances. During his confirmation hearing, he was forced to tell senators, including Senator Obama and Senator Clinton, hard is not hopeless. All is not yet lost. And created a possibility, a reasonable possibility, for an Iraq to survive that was reasonably democratic, reasonably stable, and had a foreign policy, broadly speaking, in consonance with that of the United States. That's the good news. The bad news is that all of that work was fumbled at the goal line when, on equal opportunity, I've talked about some of the mistakes made by the Bush administration, the George W. Bush administration, with the unnecessary, poorly planned, poorly implemented invasion of Iraq in 2003. Unfortunately, the end game of that Iraq war was also very badly handled. President Obama, against the advice of his Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, his Secretary of Defense, Bob Gates, best Secretary of Defense we've ever had, in my estimation, his Director of Central Intelligence, Leon Panetta, his Central Command Commander, David Petraeus, against the advice of all of those people and many, many more. President Obama decided to withdraw all American troops from Iraq at the end of 2011. Entirely predictably, al-Qaeda in Iraq, which at that point had been forced out of Iraq and into Syria, regained strength, reemerged, and over the course of this past 18 months or so, captured the western third of Iraq, all of Anbar ground over which I have fought, ground over which, on which many of my friends have bled and too many have died. All of that ground now occupied by al-Qaeda in Iraq's successor organization, the so-called Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, the most successful, the most widely dispersed terror organization in history, in human history. It holds more ground than the United Kingdom. It collects taxes, it sells oil, it pumps oil, and it exports jihad, right, around the globe over the internet, and it attracts jihadis to it, including, by published accounts, several thousand Western passport holders who are going to be, for generations to come, the next Osama bin Ladens of jihad. So the mistaken decision, an unnecessary decision to invade Iraq in 2003 led to al-Qaeda coming to Iraq and led to Iraq becoming the most important theater of war for al-Qaeda. The decision to pull all American troops out of Iraq at the end of 2011 became, in turn, a re-invitation to al-Qaeda, al-Qaeda's successor organization, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, to gather territory, to take territory in which to plan, from which to conduct attacks against the United States and our allies around the globe. So we've got that going for us. An unbelievably discouraging result, given the blood, sweat, and tears that we poured into Iraq without effect from 2003 until 2007, with reasonable effect from 2007 to 2011. The only thing that is worse is the fact that despite the clear and evident failure of the policy of too rapidly withdrawing American troops from a country which is struggling to confront an insurgency and build its own capability to take that insurgency on, is the fact that we currently plan to do the same thing again in Afghanistan. Current U.S. policy has us scheduled to withdraw all American troops from that country by the end of 2016, a date that has no military significance but does have domestic political significance in this country. And I find it astonishing that that remains official U.S. policy. I am very, very heartened by new Secretary of Defense Ash Carter's statements that he is reconsidering that policy and will take it up with the White House. And I'm hopeful that we will maintain a long-term security presence in Afghanistan. If we do not, I am confident that just as within 3 years of our withdrawal, premature withdrawal from Iraq, there were al-Qaeda forces, the Islamic State forces at the gates of Baghdad. Within 3 years, there will be Taliban back at the gates of Kabul. And it may not be necessary to emphasize, but the pillar of American counterterrorism strategy since September 11th has been that we can never again allow our enemies to have bases, geographic bases, from which to conduct attacks on us. We have given them that base in Iraq and Syria. I cannot believe we will do the same thing in Afghanistan. But I remain hopeful that we will expel the Islamic State, at least from Iraq, over the course of the remaining 2 years of this administration, that we will not pull all American troops out of Afghanistan by the end of this administration. I am hopeful that learning will happen. I am not yet optimistic, but I am hopeful. That's a great deal, I'm afraid, of bad news. And let me close, if I can, with a little bit of good news. I joined our military in 1984, 10 years after the end of the Vietnam War. and signed up for West Point. Really not very clear that West Point meant that I had to join the Army afterwards. It was a little bit of a surprise for me. I hope all of you cadets and mids realize we expect you to go to work afterwards. You're not getting this great education entirely for free, right? But when I did that, when I signed up, when I raised my right hand, my nation had been at peace for 10 years, and there was little prospect that my nation would go to war any time in the foreseeable future. The young men and women in this room, the ROTC cadets and midshipmen in this room, made a very different choice. They chose to join the American military in a time of war, knowing that there was every likelihood that they would be sent in harm's way. And all of the men, the young men in the room, had to sign up when they turned 18, despite the fact that many of them were already in uniform, had to sign up for selective service. Because when the Vietnam War ended and we began the all-volunteer force, no one believed it would work if we had a big war. And ladies and gentlemen, we are 15 years into 2 big wars. And the all-volunteer force has not only held firm, it is better today than it was on September 11th, 2001. It is the most battle-tested force in our nation's history. But it has endured only because of the commitment, the courage, the dedication of this generation of young people, right? Young men and women who knew when they raised their right hands that they would be going to war. And I've been privileged. I've been wandering around some of America's best college campuses over the past several months and have spoken with ROTC cadets, with Annapolis midshipmen, with West Point cadets. And I meet them and I shake their hands and I look in their eyes and I see their determination to keep America safe, despite the mistakes that have been made by their superiors, military, uniformed, and civilian, over the course of the past 15 years, many of which I've just described. And I meet them and I look at them and I know that our country is going to be just fine. And I would ask you to join me in thanking them for their decision to serve our country in a time of war. And ladies and gentlemen, I would welcome your questions. We have microphones. We have midshipmen. Oh, no, we don't have midshipmen. We have a gentleman over here. Sir, go ahead. Please.
Hi, my name is Stephen. I'm very curious how you feel about the Kurdish Peshmerga. And my personal opinion is that they're one of the most stable forces and cultural groups that we can rely on. And given the disintegration of Syria and northern Iraq, what nation state will exist there? And will they get one? And can we support that?
So the Kurds are, to my knowledge, the largest ethnic group in the world that doesn't have its own state. The Kurds very much want their own state, and you may recall some years ago, before Iraq, in 2010, 2011, before the premature withdrawal of American troops, the autonomous region of Kurdistan was advertising on American television, right? Kurdistan, the other Iraq, as a land of economic opportunity, which it was at that time. Pulling the American troops out didn't help. And let me talk about the mechanism, why that was so bad that allowed ISIS to do what it's done. So the long-term presence of 15 to 20,000 American troops in Iraq, as in Afghanistan, would have meant that we had advisor forces to embed inside every Iraqi battalion and brigade, would have meant that we had special forces teams, helicopters, logistics units, intelligence assets, some strike aircraft on the ground or at sea nearby. But perhaps most importantly, we would have had political leverage over Iraqi politicians through the presence of those American troops. And so it is, I don't think, a coincidence that the day after the last American troops were withdrawn from Iraq in December of 2011, that Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki, the very next day, fired and issued an arrest warrant for his Sunni vice president. That within weeks, He was firing the Sunni commanders of his battalions and brigades, experienced military leaders selected and trained by the United States, and replacing them with his Shiite cronies, who had no military experience, no trust in their units, no respect from their units, but had political loyalty to him, because Maliki was more afraid of a coup from his own forces than he was of an external attack. That turned out to be a bad gamble, and that's the reason why both the Kurdish and the Iraqi army forces suffered. Crumbled is a little too strong, but certainly were defeated by the Islamic State over the course of 14 and into 15. And so the long-term presence of American advisory forces provides both military support, intelligence support, but also political leverage to use in influencing the long-term direction of both Iraq and Afghanistan. The Kurdish ethnic group, which desperately wants its own state, suffers from geography, much as the Ukrainians do. So the Kurds have significant populations in Iraq, in Iran, and in Turkey. None of those countries are willing to give up the territory that is held by the Kurds. None of them want an independent Kurdistan, and so quite frankly, an independent Kurdistan is not going to happen in our lifetimes. I don't believe it's possible we'll see an insurgency against those three countries, but I think it would be dealt with quite brutally. I think what is likely to happen is that an Iraqi Kurdistan will return once the Islamic State forces are pushed out of Mosul and out of Kurdistan. The question of exactly when that will happen is up in the air. The Pentagon unwisely revealed some preliminary intelligence about how that fight might happen. We have since issued an official oopsie and are rethinking and regrouping. I agree with you in your assessment of the capabilities, the fighting abilities of the Kurds, of the Pesh. I am hopeful that we will reverse our current decision not to embed American ground forces, ground advisors inside their units, which would make them 3 to 5 times more effective and would enable them to rapidly get the Islamic State out of the country of Iraq. But inshallah, that will happen. More questions? Come on out. Come on, get in line. Stand, come say hi to the nice mid.
Good evening, sir. My name is Cadet Kumar from the Army program. And could you please describe the relationship between Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State in Iraq? Mm-hmm. Thank you.
So Al-Qaeda, the group, the base, began in an Egyptian prison and in the mind of Osama bin Laden, a very talented, very wealthy Saudi engineer. It took root, found a base in Pakistan on the Afghan-Pakistan border, and was inside Afghanistan when it conducted the attacks of September 11th, and moved to Pakistan, and Al-Qaeda Central resided in Pakistan for a number of years. It has essentially been destroyed. It is no longer a significant threat to the United States or our friends and allies around the globe. That core Al-Qaeda, that's the good news. The bad news is that it has morphed. It has created franchise organizations, right? The first, the one that I fought against, Al-Qaeda in Iraq. There was no Al-Qaeda in Iraq in 2003 when we invaded. It came to take advantage of the power vacuum that we created by toppling Saddam Hussein without a plan to build a better peace in the aftermath of that toppling. So St. Augustine taught us the only purpose of a war is to build a better peace. We fought a war by invading Iraq in 2003 without any plan to build a better peace in the Iraq that followed. We created the conditions that provided a new geographic base for Al-Qaeda, and that the death, the destruction, the mayhem, the incompetence that we demonstrated, that the American military, the American State Department, the U.S. as a whole demonstrated in the occupation of Iraq after the toppling of Saddam Hussein's government, created a cause célèbre, and we created a recruiting magnet for jihadis inside Iraq, and Al-Qaeda in Iraq became the most dangerous threat, radical jihadi, radical Islamist terror threat in the world. We almost defeated al-Qaeda in Iraq as a result of the surge, the counterinsurgency strategy that I described. We essentially pushed al-Qaeda in Iraq out of Iraq, rendering the name somewhat problematic for them, and they found a new base in Syria. And Syria, which was unsettled by a rebellion, a revolt against President Assad, not a very nice man. In addition to our failure, our premature withdrawal of American troops from Iraq at the end of 2011, we made another, the Obama administration made another poor decision, in my eyes, in the summer of 12, although now Secretary of Defense Panetta, Director of Central Intelligence, Petraeus, still Secretary of State Clinton, all recommended that we arm, train, and equip the moderate Syrian rebels in the summer of 12, the so-called Free Syrian Army. The president chose not to do so, and as a result, sort of our last best hope for a reasonable outcome in Syria died. Right, were murdered, largely by ISIS, some by Assad. Assad's government in Syria. And so the al-Qaeda in Iraq, now restationed in Syria, came up with a new name, the Islamic State in Iraq. First in Syria, they called themselves the Islamic State first, and then became, when they took ground inside Iraq, the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. So this is a third generation al-Qaeda. It has been unbelievably successful in conquering territory, in garnering financial resources, in attracting Western recruits, and in radicalizing Westerners over the internet who have never served on the ground in Iraq or Syria, in many cases have never met a member of this terror organization, but nonetheless decide to kill. And that has been the mechanism that has resulted in the recent murders in Paris, in Copenhagen, and in Ottawa, and you ain't seen nothing yet. So the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, now the biggest terror threat in the world, and likely to remain a problem for many years to come, I'm afraid. Sir?
Colonel, my name is Gil Ferry, and believe it or not, I'll try not to cough in my mic. 51 years ago, I went in the Army through ROTC, ended up serving with the 11th Armored Cav Regiment, Vietnam, which today, for those of you who don't know it, it is the OPFOR, the opposing force that trains all Army units before their deployment to anywhere at Camp Irwin, Fort Irwin, excuse me. Lessons learned. We learned a lot of lessons in Vietnam. For example, with tanks and armored personnel carriers, ACAVs at the time, M113s, self-propelled 155 howitzers, aircraft, gunships, etc. If we were in a jungle-type environment, actually jungle where you couldn't see 10 feet, or an elephant grass that was 8 feet high, we had no choice but to either go upwind in a helicopter, which I flew, and burn the grass down, which would burn some tripwires and eliminate some of these IEDs or command detonated mines, claymores. Or if there was no wind, you had to follow in column always the lead big boy, the tank, which could take an explosion from a 250-pound bomb that had been wired with a piece of bamboo, etc. Because if you went on line, one guy would get ahead of the other, you had no control, couldn't see the antennas in some cases, and you'd have fratricide situations. When you could go online would be when you were conducting a search and destroy operation encircling a village, and you tried to do it at night, early morning, and then I would fly around it and watch for people trying to leave the village, the bad guys, the one who wore the masks, the one who didn't want to be caught.
Yes, sir.
Okay, but in Iraq and in Afghanistan, where you basically have wide open terrain, I cannot for the life of me understand why, perhaps you covered it in your book, why tracks which can go anywhere. For God's sake, get off the roads. Don't take the path that they know you're coming on. Get 50 feet, 200 feet, 500 yards off of it where they don't know you're going to be, and they can't possibly set up IEDs everywhere to do these traumatic brain injuries to the troops, and encircle the village and do the same thing. Encircle it and literally starve the people out. Let them turn the bad guys over to you.
And so what you just described is something that H.R. McMaster did in a town named Talafar. A wonderful George Packer article on it in George wrote for the New Yorker called "The Lesson of Talafar," and I recommend it to you. H.R. was then in command of the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment, Brave Rifles, another unit you'll know. This was before the publication of the Counterinsurgency Doctrine, and in fact, we were writing the manual and writing a case study on what HR was doing, and it was a fairly extraordinary example of doctrine being written in the field and going back and forth. And literally, I was from the Pentagon sending stuff to HR, and he would say, good, car bomb, gotta go. The truth is that the lessons you learned in Vietnam on how to conduct counterinsurgency didn't just disappear. The books were literally burned. So when I was doing research on my doctoral dissertation on Vietnam, I went to the Army's Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth and visited the classified section of the library there. And I had my clearances and talked to the nice lady running the archive, and I said, ma'am, here are my clearances. I'm not going to use any of this, but it can be useful to know what's out there and to see, to get sort of my head around it. And so I just like to look at the classified archives on Vietnam. And she said, I'm sorry, son, we don't have any. And I said, ma'am, I'm sorry, it was a big war. You must have heard of it. Really, your library, you must have some classified stuff on Vietnam. And she said, no, sonny, I remember Vietnam very well, thank you. But about 10 years after Vietnam, we had a colonel running the library who had had a really bad experience in Vietnam, and he said, Vietnam was a bad war. We're not going to study it here. Get rid of all the records. And so when we published the Army Marine Corps Counterinsurgency Field Manual on December 15th, 2006, it was the first counterinsurgency manual the Army had written in 40 years. 30 years, excuse me, 1975 had been the last one, 1975 to 2006, 31 years, right? And so when George Casey, when General George Casey went to take command of the American counterinsurgency effort in Iraq in 2004, Pete Schoomaker, the Chief of Staff of the Army, Casey was the vice, gave him a copy of my book, which Newt Gingrich had brought to him, had brought to Schoomaker, had brought to the Army's chief. And Schoomaker said, the president called and said, George, I'm going to send you to Iraq to take over. And Schoomaker took, this is according to Casey, Schoomaker took a copy of my book off his desk, handed it to Casey and said, here, George, you better read this. Casey, by his own admission, went home that weekend and read my book, and it was the first book on counterinsurgency he'd read in his entire 35-year military career. So this would be as if you were coaching a Super Bowl team, right, and we're walking onto the field and we're given a defensive scheme for the first time and not practiced defense or thought about defense for 40 years. Right. That was the gap in the professional knowledge of the United States military and in particular of the United States Army in 2005 when we started writing the counterinsurgency manual. So, and I'll get to talk, I think, to some of the cadets in mid some more about this tomorrow, right? But ladies and gentlemen, you have a professional responsibility to understand your profession. The American people are investing enormous resources in you so that you know the whole gamut of combat, from peace through low-intensity conflict, middle conflict, nuclear war, right? The whole spectrum of conflict. You need to be masters of your profession. The United States military had not mastered its profession in the hangover after Vietnam, and we have paid dearly for that neglect, for that professional neglect. questions.
Hi, I'm Don Rinker, and I had a question. I'd like to shift the venue to Benghazi. A terrible attack occurred a couple years ago. 4 Americans died in that attack. The ambassador was a graduate of this university. A lot of finger pointing. I do not know if the intelligence community failed us in that situation. It's hard to believe that we're spread thin and we cannot protect men and women who are serving our country overseas in this capacity.
So many mistakes. Libya is something that I still have a hard time believing happened. So Benghazi is not the problem. Particularly, Benghazi is a symptom of the problem. The problem was that we waged war against Muammar Gaddafi and his government for humanitarian reasons. It was arguably the first humanitarian war we fought, Somalia, perhaps. But the Obama administration, having come to power, having come to office as a result of American discontent, disbelief, anger at fighting a war without having a plan to build a better peace afterwards in Iraq and Afghanistan, particularly Iraq. The Obama administration fought a war in Libya to topple a dictator without a plan to build a better peace in the aftermath. And so we toppled Gaddafi with no idea who was going to replace him and without providing any sort of stability in the aftermath of his toppling. And as usually happens in the absence of order, the most powerful and the most ruthless came to power. And so in Libya, there were a number of terror groups, including some that developed al-Qaeda affiliations. Our ambassador, I believe personally, made an unwise choice to go to Benghazi on September 11th. Not a good day to travel in a very unsettled part of the country. However, you are incorrect in your assessment that you believe that we have sufficient diplomatic security resources to protect all of our diplomats abroad. In fact, the State Department's request for funds for diplomatic security had been cut by the Congress beginning in 2007, 2008. The when the Republicans took over Republicans took back over in 2010 and cut diplomatic security funds, and the State Department in general is unbelievably poorly funded and an embarrassment to the United States. There are more members of military bands, ladies and gentlemen, than there are Foreign Service officers in the entire U.S. Foreign Service. Right? And so the State Department gets by on far less than it ought to. We have learned from, partial answer to the previous question, we have learned from Benghazi. We've actually stationed, stood up a number of Marine quick response units throughout the Middle East and North Africa. We are going to continue to see Benghazi kind of situations. Governments beset by insurgencies, that in some cases we support the government, in other cases we are going to support the insurgents. This is going to be a fact of life, a fact of the international system for the remainder of our lives, all of us in this room, including the cadets and the mids. And so we need to do a whole bunch of things better, including intelligence gathering, diplomatic security, and different sorts of military responses and different sorts of military units, because governments are going to continue to be under pressure, and I believe they're going to continue to fall, and we're going to have terror in the aftermath. Sir. I think him first and then you, sir. He's got the mic. 1 second, sir. Go ahead, take it.
Thank you so much.
Yep, we'll come to him next. We got time.
So my name is Raymond Johnlow. I'm a professor here. I've even taught in this lecture hall. I want to pick up on the last point you were just making about the ongoing role of insurgency in our foreseeable future, and thinking that it's been most of a decade since the manual that you participated in putting together, but also now looking to the future. Can you describe, not in detail, but strategically, large picture, what are some of the changes that you would like to see implemented in future thinking about counterinsurgency by the U.S. military and also in concert with our allies? Thank you.
That is not a plant, but it's a gift of a question, so thank you, sir. Always nice to have another professor in the room. So there are two major, the two major failings of the U.S. government over the past 15 years in counterinsurgency and in counterinsurgency. At the grand strategic level, I'll back up. There are 6 logical lines of operation in a counterinsurgency campaign: combat operations against identified enemies, building host nation security forces, we'll come back to that in a second, providing good governance, essential services to the population, economic development, and most importantly, the decisive line of operations in a counterinsurgency campaign, information operations, because ultimately you're trying to change people's minds to convince them to back the government rather than the insurgents, and that it's safe for them to do so. So according to the manual, the decisive line of operations in a counterinsurgency campaign, information operations. That being said, you would expect the guys who wrote the counterinsurgency manual to have a chapter on information operations, since it's decisive. Right. Midshipmen and cadets, right? If you say the main effort is Alpha Company, right, and then don't say tasks to Alpha Company and support to Alpha Company in your order, you will fail, as you should. Right. So if the decisive line of operations is information operations, why did the smart cookies who wrote the counterinsurgency manual not write a chapter on information operations? And the sad truth is, so when I outlined the manual at the front page bar in DuPont Circle on a cocktail napkin, true story, right, I had a chapter on information operations. We were not allowed to write it and put it in our manual because it's an Army Marine Corps manual, and the Army and the Marines are not responsible for information operations. The State Department, the underfunded State Department that I just spoke about, is responsible for information operations. They don't have the resources to do it, but they maintain the authority to do so. And so the single biggest mistake we've made as a nation in the last 15 years of war against radical Islamic extremism is the failure to recreate the U.S. Information Agency. So during the Cold War, which was primarily an economic war, secondarily a military war, and only third a war of ideas, we had the U.S. Information Agency, which did good work conducting information campaigns, conducting information operations. This is primarily, we are currently fighting primarily a war of ideas, secondarily a military war, and only third, essentially negligible, an economic war against radical Islamic extremism. But we have failed to recreate the U.S. Information Agency. Nobody is in charge or is resourced to conduct the information war. And so even as we continue to conduct effective counterterrorism operations and kill insurgents and terrorists around the globe, more of them are being produced. And until you find a way to change the dynamic that causes people to become insurgents, right, this war will continue forever. So first, grand strategic error, the failure to create an information operations component of the U.S. government and resource it properly. At the military level, right, the greatest failing, I said, remember, train and equip host nation security forces. That's the military exit plan. We have failed to create sufficient advisory forces to meet the need in Iraq and Afghanistan around the globe. My last job on active duty in the military was training advisory teams that embedded inside Iraqi and Afghan security forces. I wrote a piece about it, analyzing the weaknesses in our program and recommending changes. I used the word ad hoc 7 times in a 10-page paper to describe current U.S. policy implementation. We are not any better at it 10 years later. And I strongly believe, ladies and gentlemen in uniform, right, the most important, as I said in that paper, and as Secretary Gates later paraphrased, the most important military component of the long war against radical Islamic extremism is not likely going to be the fighting we do, but how well we enable and empower our friends and allies to fight against our common enemies. To do that effectively, we need trained and well-equipped advisors to multiply our combat effectiveness. We have not built that capability in our military. Maybe next year. Now this gentleman, yep.
You may want to avoid this, and I would certainly understand, but obviously a gentleman that we all respect a great deal is in the sights of the Washington Long Knives. And who's behind that, in your opinion, and will he survive these attacks?
You're talking about
Petraeus.
You're talking about Petraeus. Yeah, so on the list of the unfortunate situations, I happen to know almost all of the players in this drama. I've known Dave and Holly Petraeus for many years. I know Paula. I know her husband Scott, and I knew I was human, but I really didn't think Dave Petraeus was, and it turns out he is. Who knew, right? And so he had an affair with Paula, which he shouldn't have done, obviously. But that's a very human failing, and I forgive him for that, and think the nation should forgive him for that. That's really between him and Holly and God. Although I wouldn't want to face Holly in that situation. I have a harder time with the more recent revelations, and so Petraeus admitted to giving Paula notebooks in which he had classified information, including names and techniques of intelligence gathering that had Paula lost control of them, to which Paula was not authorized access, to which Petraeus was not authorized. He was not authorized to keep them on his person at home after he left command in Iraq, and the loss or release of which could have done grave damage to the security of this nation. And so the process by which all of this came to light is embarrassing, and it involves jealousy and other very human emotions. The question now is Petraeus done? And I fear that politically the answer is yes. Right, I've long believed, he has not said this, and he and I have not talked about this, but I've long believed the reason he was given the agency in 2011 was to preclude him running as a Republican vice presidential candidate in 2012. I think President Obama was rightly concerned about that, and that's the reason, one of the reasons John Huntsman was given his ambassadorship to China in 2009. He didn't see it coming, but Obama did. Obama thinks deep that way. So I think Petraeus, if he had elected political ambitions, which he swears he does not, I think that they are done. I am pleased to note that the press tells us, this is not, I don't know this from him, but the press tells us that he continues to consult with the White House on national security issues. John McCain has invited him to testify before the Senate Armed Services Committee. He refused to do so until this matter was closed. It is my belief now that he will be able to do so and will return to the public eye more than he has. There are lessons here, ladies and gentlemen, for all of us, right? For all the good service that General Petraeus did to this nation, literally irreplaceable, and without a doubt the greatest general of his generation. He was brought down by a very human failing, and he is not the first to do so, and he will not be the last. But ladies and gentlemen, try to make sure that you do not follow those particular footsteps. Sir. Sorry, Chester.
Harold Smith, scholar in residence here. You haven't
That's such a great job title.
It is a good job. You haven't talked at all about how we could have more Allied participation. Would you mind taking that one on?
No, it's complicated. So I have a little bit, right? So the advisors are designed to get our allies to do the heavy lifting for us, and we have not created a system that makes effective combat multipliers out of our allies, and the Kurds, the Peshmerga, the Iraqi forces are some of those allies who would be great. The sad truth is that many of our traditional allies are demobilizing. The British, in particular, I think have eliminated so much of their military capability that they are essentially no longer a great power. It is increasingly going to be the United States that bears the load. I mentioned earlier how the Sunni Iraqis didn't like living under al-Qaeda in Iraq's rule. The good news is that the Islamic State are also enormous jerks, doesn't begin to do them justice, barbarians, right, and are inspiring revulsion among the moderate Muslims of the world, and Jordan in particular, and correctly, I think, in response to the immolation alive of that Jordanian pilot, a devout Muslim, father of 5, the Jordanians have said, okay, here you go. And my hope and my belief is that this is ultimately a very great part of this war we're fighting is a struggle inside Islam. Right, there's a radical interpretation of Islam that is held by a very, very small number of Muslims, but there are more than a billion Muslims in the world. That small number, 50,000, 100,000, 200,000, can do enormous damage in this interconnected world we live in. Ultimately, what we need to do is mobilize all of those other, right, 999 million Muslims to police themselves, to change the shape of their community and mobilize them to join us in this fight, in particular in this war of ideas. And those are the kind of things that I think the recreated U.S. Information Agency could be doing. That's where we most need the help, right? We don't really need a whole lot more fighter planes. We've got plenty of those, right? What we do need is moderate Muslim voices saying killing Muslims, innocent Muslims, is wrong. And one of the real ironies here is that these barbarians who claim to kill in the name of Allah are killing almost exclusively innocent Muslims. It's astounding. And we are not telling that story effectively. Young lady back here, please. I'm sorry.
Good evening, sir. My name is Cadet Tran from the Army ROTC program. Earlier, you mentioned a 2016 timeline to pull out troops, and you also noted that the Secretary of Defense is planning to take a look at the plan and hopefully change it. How do you think, considering the presidential campaign coming up, that it will affect that particular turnout, and which inevitably affects the soldiers that served past that year? And more importantly, do you see our leadership learning from the past of what has happened before? Because you said you were hopeful, so I was just really curious.
The last question is a great one. I do not believe that we have been particularly fortunate in our presidents and our foreign policy presidents in this century. Right, so President George W. Bush believed too much in the use of military force, believed that military force could solve almost any problem, and he was wrong. And this president is extremely uncomfortable with the use of military force. And while he is right that military force is not the answer to every problem, it is the only answer to some problems. And certainly, I very strongly believe, had he left those 20,000 US troops in Iraq in 2011, they'd still be there, but the Islamic State would not. Right? And so I am hopeful that that pendulum, which swung fairly wildly, right, from here to here, is going to center in 2016. And I believe we're likely to see a campaign between Jeb Bush and Hillary Clinton. I think that both of those two candidates I think that they will both be here, right? There will be very little space between the two of them on foreign policy, and frankly, that's the way it ought to be. There's been a broad consensus on American foreign policy, certainly throughout the Cold War. We haven't seen that in the wake of September 11th. I think we're ready for that pendulum to center, and I'm hopeful that will happen. I also very strongly believe that whether the next president is named Clinton or Bush, or candidate yet to be mentioned, that candidate will lean very hard on President Obama and will support Ash Carter in the request to rethink this premature pullout of American troops from Afghanistan, because whoever that next president is, they are not going to want to have to do what Obama had to do during his first year. Before he even had his full cabinet installed, there was waiting on his desk for him when he got to the Oval Office a request for 30,000 troops in Afghanistan. Right? And he had to make that decision long before he wanted to, long before he was ready to, before he even had his team in. The next president is going to have to make the same kind of decision. If the president pulls those 20,000 out, he's going to have to stick those 20,000 right back in and fast and probably under fire. And nobody is going to want that to happen. So I am enormously hopeful that we will see lessons learned at the presidential level. My book sales would not seem to indicate that that's happening, but could be wrong. Thank you. We had a question up here, sir.
Good evening, sir. Midshipman Second Class Myers, Navy ROTC. Sir, you spoke about Al-Qaeda of Iraq moving into Syria and finding haven and being able to begin ISIL. As long as unstable areas like Syria exist, are we ever going to see a victory in the Middle East?
The problem is actually bigger than the Middle East. It's even worse than you think. So I've argued that one of the lessons of September 11th is that instability anywhere in the world can be a threat to the United States and our interests everywhere. And that's a slight exaggeration, but it's not a huge exaggeration. So we are fighting an opportunistic enemy, a terrorist organization that has what my friend David Kilcullen has called a global insurgency strategy. And there's a wonderful piece in the most recent Atlantic. The Atlantic has been killing it. So the January Atlantic had The Tragedy of the American Military by Jim Fallows, right? An incorrect piece, but an important piece, right? And the most recent one has a very good piece about what ISIS wants. And what the Islamic State wants is the same thing Al-Qaeda wanted, right? The restoration of the 7th century caliphate and the imposition of Sharia law against that entire expanse of territory. Right? That desire, that belief is strong in the 100,000 or 200,000 radical Islamists in the world. Unfortunately, literally every day, more people with that belief system are being manufactured. Right? People are being radicalized over the internet to have that belief set. And so I very strongly believe that both we can't give them physical territory in which to prepare for attacks on us, as we currently have in Iraq and Syria, as I fear we are going to in Afghanistan. But also we can't give them virtual territory on the internet to own. And we're currently doing that as well. So in both the physical space and on the internet, we are not currently denying our enemies freedom of action. We should do so far more effectively than we are now. My hope is frankly that a bunch of you are going to be a part of those efforts. We've got someone in blue over here. Last question? Okay, no pressure, Air Force. Last question.
Good evening, sir. Cadet Isak, Air Force ROTC. In regards to the Atlantic article, The Tragedy of the U.S. Military, in your own perspective, what do you believe the U.S. government should do in order to kind of promote self-criticism of the U.S. military without being overboard or too radical in its criticisms?
So I happen to think that I do that pretty well. Let me. It's a great way to end. So Jim Fallows, very interesting guy. By his own admission, starved himself while a student at Harvard in the 1960s to render himself 4F unfit for the draft. And he feels very guilty about that, has written very movingly about it in the Texas Monthly, and he references that piece, puts a hot link to that piece actually, in the Atlantic Monthly piece, The Tragedy of the American Military. And this piece, this January Atlantic Monthly cover piece, is a giant hodgepodge of a piece, 10,000 words. He attacks the F-35. Where's my Air Force and my Navy fighter pilots, right? Air power. Yeah, I mean, the F-35 is not the way to accomplish any one of the missions that it's supposed to have, but he's right about the F-35. He is not right, I don't believe, at all about what the primary thrust of his article, which is that the all-volunteer force has borne too great a share of the burdens over the past 15 years, or at least his solutions to that problem. I think he presents no solutions to that problem, and so I'm quoted in the piece. Jim says that he likes me, respects me, but disagrees with me when I say the all-volunteer force gives the President of the United States extraordinary freedom of action to do things like keep 15,000 troops in Iraq forever, to keep 15,000 American troops in Afghanistan forever, to police the fringes of empire, to create and maintain the peace and the stability that allow the economic growth and development that we've seen over the past 75 years since the end of the Second World War, the greatest period of economic expansion the world has ever seen. We've lifted more humans out of poverty in these 75 years than has ever happened before in any millennium. It's an extraordinary accomplishment, and a huge reason for that accomplishment is America's sons and daughters in uniform and the American military we've built. Jim thinks that it is a shame that so few Americans are, that our sons and daughters in uniform are making repeated sacrifices in order to keep us safe, promote that economic prosperity, and that the rest of America is not. His solution to that, he suggests, is a return to the draft, which no one in uniform thinks is a good idea. The all-volunteer, the all-professional force, composed exclusively of people who want to be there, is the most successful military in history, will remain that way. There is no need for a return to the draft. There is a need, a huge need, to get the rest of America more involved in these wars that we have been fighting, and I predict will continue to fight for the lifetime of everyone in this room. And I believe that President George W. Bush missed an historic opportunity when on September 12, 2001, he did not say, rather than telling America to go to the mall, what he should have said is, ladies and gentlemen, we are at war. We're not yet sure exactly against whom. What we do know is that we're going to win, and that doing so is going to take resources. And therefore, I am asking Congress to immediately impose a 50-cent a gallon tax on gasoline, a national security tax. And I will come back for more if I need it. But it's going to take resources, it's going to take volunteers. Everybody needs to give something, right? And the failure to do that has meant that this war has not just been on the backs, been fought on the backs of our all-volunteer military force, which I'm okay with, right? But I'm okay that this is the first generation, that mine is the first generation to fight a war without a draft. I actually think that's okay. Right? What I don't think is okay is this is the first generation to fight a war without a tax increase. And so the $4 trillion cost of these wars, $4 trillion, 25% of the entire accumulated deficit this country has accumulated over its entire 250 years of existence, right, has all been put on the credit card. And so, cadets and midshipmen, You are going to have to pay for our war. That is a gift we have given you. You're welcome, right? And I am absolutely confident you're going to have to pay for your war as well. And so as we go out into a beautiful California night and think about, right, gray-haired people in the room, as we think about our responsibility to these brave young men and women who have volunteered to sign up to protect us, we should think hard about the conversation we should be having with our elected representatives about why it is that we're asking them to fight for us and pay for the privilege of fighting for us, and we're not willing to do any of the paying ourselves. I obviously deeply honored to be here, to be the 31st Nimitz lecturer. Most of all, I'm deeply honored to be here in the presence of these cadets and midshipmen. We should all endeavor to be worthy of the sacrifices they have promised to make on our behalf. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.